Hello, my name is Ashley Covert, and in this presentation, I offer a critical evaluation of NIMP's 2025 study titled Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury, published in Brain Science. The study examines a frequently overlooked clinical phenomenon, the neurological harm that survivors of an interpartner violence sustain through repeated head trauma and strangulation-induced hypoxia. My analysis considers the study's theoretical framing, its methodological strengths and limitations, and its significance for behavioral neuroscience. I will proceed in 6 sections. I begin with the neurophysiological framework that distinguishes two injury mechanisms, then outline the study's background and purpose, its specific aims, and its methodology. I subsequently examine the principal findings before offering a critical evaluation of the work's contributions and limitations. Throughout, I will keep one analytical question in view: whether prevailing clinical models are adequate to detect injury arising from multiple concurrent mechanisms. I'll begin with the theoretical framework. In neuropsychology, brain injuries are classified by mechanism, since the mechanism determines the pattern of damage. Traumatic brain injury results from mechanical force, whereas hypoxic-anoxic injury results from oxygen deprivation, mostly common through strangulation, and produces diffuse cellular death. A central limitation of the existing literature is that clinical models, screening instruments, and recovery timelines were derived largely from athletes and military personnel, not from survivors who experienced both mechanisms deliberately and concurrently. Let me explain why the mechanisms matter so much, because it's really the heart of the brain science here. When the brain is hit, the damage starts with force. The brain is soft, about the feel of firm jelly, and it floats around inside a hard skull. A blow makes it slide and twist, so it bumps against the bone and the long nerve fibers that carry signals get stretched and torn. This kind of harm tends to be patchy. It shows up wherever the strain was worst, often deep in the brain where the wiring bends, and it can cut the connections that let different brain areas talk to each other. Oxygen loss does its damage in a completely different way. Here, there is no blow at all. Instead, the brain is simply starved of oxygen-rich blood it needs to stay alive. Because brain cells cannot store fuel, they start to fail within seconds and can die within minutes. And this harm is widespread rather than patchy. It can touch cells all over the brain at once, including the memory center, which is one of the first areas to suffer when oxygen runs low. So we end up with two very different recipes for damage, one driven by force in certain spots, and the other by a lack of oxygen everywhere. This is why brain scientists treat them as separate kinds of injuries, each with its own pattern of damage, its own symptoms, and its own path to recovery. To set up the study, let's look at how common this is. About 1 in 3 women go through partner violence, and attacks tend to land on the head, neck, and face, the very parts of the body that are tied to brain injury. As we just saw, those are the very regions where a blow or a choking injury does the most harm to the brain, so the fact that abusers strike there so often is what turns partner violence into a brain injury problem. And for some groups, the risk is far higher than 1 in 3. Among multiracial women in the United States, the lifetime risk reaches almost 64%, and across different parts of the world, it runs anywhere from 16% to 40%. Even though this is so common, these injuries are rarely caught. Survivors often do not think their symptoms, like trouble thinking, headaches, and body aches, to a brain injury, and the people who help them rarely ask about it or test for it. This leaves a big gap in care. In brain science term, it means a whole group of people are living with real specific brain damage that almost no one is naming or treating. It is worth specifying the injury mechanism precisely. Mechanical trauma arises from blows or impacts, rotational forces from shaking displace the brain, and strangulation deprives the brain of oxygen and blood flow. A subsequent loss of consciousness is regarded clinically as an indicator of a probable brain injury. Critically, for most survivors, there are not isolated events, but repeated, intentional injuries sustained over extended periods of time, and in some cases, multiple mechanisms occur within a single assault. This pattern of repeated dual mechanism injury disguises partner-inflicted brain injury from the single concussion event. Turning to the methodology, the study employed a cross-sectional survey administered through in-person interviews, a format suited to sensitive subject matter. The sample comprised of 47 survivors seeking domestic violence services in Ohio in 2019. Participants were predominantly women and disproportionately economically disadvantaged, with more than 40% receiving Medicaid. The study was conducted within a community-based participatory action research framework in which survivors and advocates contribute to the design and interpretation, a notable methodological strength given the stigmatized nature of the topic. The interviews assessed three domains. First, lifetime exposure to head trauma and strangulation across all sources, including childhood, familial, and sexual violence, not solely the current partner. Second, episode level detail concerning whether both injuries co-occurred within the first and most recent partner violence episode, which permits interference about concurrent injury. Third, loss of consciousness and its frequency, a recognized marker of probable brain injury. Assessment at both the lifetime and episode levels is what enabled the documentation of concurrent dual mechanism injury. The principal findings are as follows. Across the lifespan, more than 80% of survivors had experienced both intentional head trauma and strangulation. Approximately 49% reported that both occurred within a single episode. More than 60% had lost consciousness following an assault at least once, and 44% on more than one occasion. Given the sample size of 47, these figures should be interpreted as indicative prevalence estimates rather than precise population rates. The principal findings are as follows. Across the lifespan, more than 80% of survivors had experienced both intentional head trauma and strangulation. Approximately 49% reported that both occurred within a single episode. More than 60% had lost consciousness following an assault at least once, and 44% on more than one occasion. Given the sample size of 47, these figures should be interpreted as indicative prevalence estimates rather than precise population rates. The principal findings are as follows. Across the lifespan, more than 80% of survivors had experienced both intentional head trauma and strangulation. Approximately 49% reported that both occurred within a single episode. More than 60% had lost consciousness following an assault at least once, and 44% of them on more than one occasion. Given the sample size of 47, these figures should be interpreted as indicative prevalence estimates rather than precise population rates. Let me put these numbers into brain terms, because each one is telling us something different here. Start with the 82%. When more than 4 out of 5 survivors have taken a blow to the head and choking injury over their lives, dual mechanism injury is not a rare condition. It is the normal pattern for this group. Any picture of their brain health has to begin by assuming both kinds of damage are present and not just one. Now look at loss of consciousness, which more than 60% reported. Blacking out is not simply fainting. It means the injury was strong enough to briefly switch off the brain's normal working state, which points to a widespread disruption rather than a small local bump. And the 44% who lost consciousness more than once matters even more because each blackout is a sign that the brain was knocked offline again, often before it fully recovered from the time before. Read together, these numbers describe a brain that has been repeatedly and broadly disrupted, not lightly just bruised. I want to highlight one finding in particular as it constitutes to the study's central contribution. Approximately half of the survivors experienced head trauma and strangulation within the same violent episode. The biological implication is significant. Consider what happens at the level of the neuron when these two mechanisms arrive together. Mechanical force stretches and tears axons and disrupts all cell membrane, triggering a cascade of chemical changes that temporarily increase the brain's demand for energy and oxygen. At precisely that moment, strangulation cuts off the oxygen and blood flow to the brain that needs to meet that heightened demand. The injured tissue is therefore asked to repair itself under exactly the conditions that make repair impossible. And the result is that these two insults likely interact and compound rather than to simply add together. This is why a combined injury cannot be understood as a concussion plus a separate choking event. It is a qualitatively different injury, and that is the empirical basis for treating partner-inflicted brain injury as a distinct dual mechanism clinical category. A second finding concerns the role of repetition. More than 60% of survivors had lost consciousness at least once, and 44% on multiple occasions. The clinical significance lies in the repetition. Deliberately inflicted recurrent injuries differ qualitatively from a single concussion and are associated with cumulative effects. A loss of consciousness indicates a probable rather than confirmed injury. I'll now turn to a critical appraisal, beginning with the study's strengths. First, it is conceptually original, defining partner-inflicted brain injury as a precise and researchable construct. Second, its episode-level evidence constitutes a genuine and methodological contribution, demonstrating two mechanisms within a single assault. Third, the community-based participatory design facilitates candid disclosures on a stigmatized subject. Finally, the whole life analytic lens captures the full cumulative injury burden. Collectively, these represent substantiated contribution to the field. The study also has clear limitations. The sample of 47 survivors from a single state is small and geographically constrained, which limits generalizability. The absence of a comparison group means the design can describe a pattern but cannot isolate the injury's specific effects. The data are self-reported and retrospective, introducing potential recall bases, particularly as trauma can affect memory. Finally, no neuroimaging or neuropsychological testing was conducted, so the injuries are probable rather than confirmed. The study is therefore best understood as an initial characterization of the problem rather than a definitive estimate. So, why does this matter for behavioral neuroscience? First, it challenges injury models predicated on single mechanical concussion and argues for frameworks accommodating combined and repeated injury. Second, it draws attention to the understudied, predominantly female population historically underrepresented in the literature. Third, it reinforces the link between repeated injury and the cognitive and affect sequelae survivors report. Finally, it supports the case for routine brain injury screening in service settings. This is where evidence becomes obligation. The implications are concrete. Make screening for head trauma and strangulation routine, not rare. Recognize the dual trauma and treat the psychological and neurological wound together because survivors carry both. Open new research into concurrent and repeated injury and build the clinical model we still lack. And measure outcomes. Track whether our accommodations and referrals truly help. A finding is only as powerful as what we choose to do with it. Here you see the study's implication for practice and research. For practice, the authors recommend that education and screening for head trauma and strangulation become routine within domestic violence services, and that both the psychological and neurological dimensions of injury be addressed concurrently. For research, they call for a systematic study of concurrent and repeated injuries and the development of corresponding clinical protocols and models. They further emphasize outcome measurements, the systematic evaluation of accommodations and referrals, and the periodic reassessment of survivors' needs. The authors also present an applied framework for trauma-informed practice called CARE. The first component, C, stands for connect. This is where it concerns establishing the trust necessary for disclosure. A, acknowledge, refers to recognizing the characteristic effects of head trauma and strangulation. Respond denotes providing functional and social support appropriate for brain injury needs. Evaluate involves the ongoing reassessment of survivor needs and the effectiveness of the support. The framework operationalizes the study's findings into a structured model for service delivery. In conclusion, the study demonstrates that intimate partner violence injuries the brain through two concurrent mechanisms: mechanical trauma and oxygen deprivation, which are common across the lifespan, frequently co-occurring within a single episode and are often repeated. Notwithstanding its small, descriptive, self-reported design, the study makes a meaningful contribution by defining partner-inflicted brain injury and reframing survivors as important and under-recognized brain injury population. It indicates that behavioral neuroscience should investigate the combined injury, develop appropriate screening instruments, and inform treatment. I want to end on what this means for the field. For a long time, brain science treated injuries like this as if they were invisible because no one was looking for them and no one was counting them. The study is one of the first to make that invisible injury visible, to give it a name and to show that it's common, that it harms the brain in two ways at once, and that it keeps happening. The takeaway is simple but urgent. If we want to understand the full range of how brains get hurt, we cannot keep leaving these survivors out of the science. Thank you and have a great day.